in the post-pandemic recovery, supported by the ILC Partners Programme. My name is Sean Crawford. I'm a partner at EY, also, as I say, we're partner of the ILC, but I'm also an ILC trustee. We're joined by an expert panel of speakers today to discuss how COVID-19 has impacted on, one, the economy, so older consumers, older workers, business impact. Secondly, housing and investments. So really, how do we live well sustainably in the future? And third, care and the health, the demand really for healthy living. The speakers will give a short presentation before we get into a discussion, and they'll be talking about what COVID-19 has accelerated and how we harness this. And secondly, what COVID-19 has restricted and how we fill the void. And finally, what has progressed despite COVID-19 and what can that tell us? We then really want to hear from you and your views in the Q&A. I'm sure all of us now have got very used to Zoom over the course of the last 18 months, and you'll see a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there. And please put in questions as you want to. We will answer some of them throughout the presentation, but really once the speakers have spoken, we will probably pick some of those questions up directly with them. But before we start, there are a few housekeeping rules to go through. I mean, there may well be internet issues for some of you, sound and video, so please do bear with us if this occurs. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat function as long as the Q&A function. If you want to pick questions or apart from just questions, just comments, please put that in the chat. If you have any issues with your audio or video throughout the webinar, just try to connect with an Ethernet cable or through a hotspot on your phone. And if you get disconnected from the webinar for any reason at all, please do use the same link in the confirmation email. We invited comments on Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. At ILC UK. Please join the conversation on that as you wish. Now, I'll just introduce you now to the four panelists, and then we'll get going with the questions. So, the first panelist is Dr. Sam Roberts. So, Sam is the Managing Director of Health and Care at Legal & General, focusing on L&G's investment strategy across the health and care sector within L&G's capital and retail retirements businesses. Prior to this, Sam was the Chief Executive of the Accelerated Access Collaborative, the national umbrella organisation for health innovation, hosted in NHS England and NHS Improvement. And Sam has worked in healthcare for almost 20 years, originally as a doctor before undertaking an MBA and joining McKinsey & Company, followed by a number of senior roles in the NHS. We'll then have Emily Allen speaking. Emily serves as the Director of Thought Leadership and Advocacy at Home Instead Senior Care, responsible for shepherding the company's global engagement with others and other organisations working to improve the lives of older people and their families. Home Instead is the world's leading provider of home care services that empower people to age at home with dignity and respect. Then we have Jane Ashcroft. Now, Jane joined Anchor in 1999 from Bupa, where she had acquired Care First PLC, where she was the personnel director. She was appointed Chief Executive of Anchor on the 9th of March 2010 and led the merger with Hanover Housing in 2018 to create Anchor Hanover, England's largest not-for-profit provider of housing and care for older people. Prior to Care First, she held HR and governance roles with Bromford Housing Group and Midlands Electricity. Jane was a founder of Associated Retirement Community Operators, representing the growing market for retirement village provision in the UK, and is currently their Vice Chair. She's also Vice Chair of the National Housing Federation, which represents housing stations across England, and she's a Fellow of the Chartered Governance Institute and a member of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. She was also awarded a CBE in the 2013 New Year's Honours for services to older people. Then we have Professor Les Mayhew at the end, but not clearly last, should I say. He joined ILC in October 2020 as Head of Global Research and is working on a range of ILC research projects, as well as enhancing ILC's research approach and strategy. Les is also part-time Professor of Statistics at the Business School, formerly CAS, City University, London, and Managing Director of Mayhew Harper Associates Limited. His previous experience includes 20 years in the Department of Health and Social Security, the Department of Social Security of HM Treasury, and the Office of National Statistics, where he was a director. He's an alumnus of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna and an honorary fellow of the Institute of Actuaries and a member of the Royal Economic Society. You can see we have a great panel here together, of a really well-qualified panel for this discussion. So I'm first of all now going to head over to Sam, if I could do, Dr. Sam Roberts. perhaps we could have shares your insights and thoughts on these topics, please. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
So just a couple of minutes on the three questions: what's accelerated, what's restricted, and then what's progressed despite COVID. My background is very kind of health orientated, and there are others on this call that will speak much more eloquently about domiciliary and residential care, so I'll only touch on that briefly. So firstly, what's accelerated and how do we harness it? I think the kind of success story from a health perspective last year, other than obviously vaccination, is digital first care. You know, if you think not so far back to the NHS long-term plan, we were talking about having digital first primary care fully implemented by 2023-24, and within a year it was pretty much rolled out throughout the country, you know, 99% of practices. So that's one thing, with about 56% of primary care consultations now happening face-to-face, whereas pre-pandemic they were 80%. You can argue if that's a good or bad thing, but there's definitely been kind of an unprecedented acceleration. So that's the first thing that we've seen. The second, and kind of related, is that there's been a complete boom in health tech investing in Europe and the US, and we're seeing a bunch of kind of homegrown unicorns emerging, which is pretty exciting. You know, you've got to remember, a couple of years ago we were saying, could the UK life sciences industry ever have a kind of non-biotech unicorn? So that's been like another runaway success. But onto the things that have been restricted and how to fill the void. I think the most obvious lack has been the lack of routine care in the NHS. So 400,000 people being managed for COVID has led to a displacement of all sorts of activity. But the two that are receiving most attention at the moment, the first is kind of the 50,000 missing cancer diagnoses, where we know they're 50,000 less than pre-pandemic. We don't quite know where those people are in the system and where they're going to pop up. So, you know, how does the system manage that? And then the second thing is, we know there's about 4 million less elective procedures pre versus post-pandemic. And those are two kind of obviously significant problems for people of all age groups, particularly the elderly, but they're also areas where we haven't seen huge amounts of innovation in terms of, you know, prioritizing elective care or doing elective care more quickly. So I think that will be interesting to see how we cope with that rather than doing more of the same. So that's the one area that's been restricted. The other, which I'll leave more for Emily and Jane to touch on, but we've seen kind of an ongoing decline in bed occupancy in care homes, with some emergence of negative sentiment around placing one's loved ones in care homes. And, you know, some reports by Lang & Buisson of contraction of the market value. But, you know, we're pretty far away from it, so we'll leave it to others to comment on it, whether that's actually the reality on the ground. So that's what's been restricted. Then what's carried on despite it all? We're seeing two things. So firstly, this kind of ongoing debate about how one understands, finds and funds social care, whether it be domiciliary or residential, is just continuing unabated. In the UK, it doesn't look like we're going to have much of a policy solution to the funding of social care anytime soon. And so kind of despite the pandemic at L&G, we launched a free service called Care Concierge that helps people navigate this journey through, you know, a call center and website and online calculator. And since in the first 4 months of this year, we've had 35,000 people access the service. So clearly still a huge need to kind of navigate this very, very difficult time. The second thing that we're seeing is within healthcare, much more of a focus on prediction and prevention. So it was flavor of the month before the pandemic, but I think the kind of associations between COVID mortality and some of the things like multimorbidity, BMI, etc., seem to have accelerated the push. And two things that we saw late last year and the beginning of this year, which are pretty promising on that front, are on prediction. The UK has announced the biggest ever trial, I believe, of blood-based cancer diagnostics with a company called Grail. So that's, you know, a blood test that is theoretically able to identify 50 different types of cancer without doing scans of individual parts of your body. So that should start later this year, which would be a real game changer, should it prove to work. And then on prevention, the old chestnut of menu labeling, which has been around for ages, it's been great evidence that it actually works to reduce BMI at a population level, was announced as a public policy in May this year. So I think on those two fronts, we've seen things that have been an issue before the pandemic that have kind of continued to gather steam throughout. So that's my 5 minutes. I'm sure it's up. Who should I hand over to next?
Thank you, Sam. That's really good. Some really scary stats in that as well, which I'm sure we'll come back to shortly. Yeah. So really, I think we can hand over to Emily. We'll come back to questions with you, Sam, later. Thank you.
Fantastic. I promised Sean that I was going to say good morning because I'm located in Omaha, Nebraska in the States. So good morning from me, good afternoon to all of you. Just for a little bit of context for any of you who are unfamiliar with Home Instead as a global organization, but maybe familiar with Home Instead within the United Kingdom. We're 26 years young, we're based in the States, we're currently in 14 global markets, and we have more than 1,200 locations around the globe. And we provide in-home care for older adults, wherever that older adult calls home, whether it's in a traditional facility, living with a loved one or a partner, living with an adult child, or a traditional home that maybe they grew up in, even hospice. And the focus of the care that Home Instead provides is relationship-based care, not task-based care. Relationship-based care helps maintain health and independence. It assists with activities of daily living. Our caregivers keep on top of signs or symptoms of decline and disease, and we can really aid in combating social isolation and loneliness when life can be isolating. And we really saw an increase in that during the COVID pandemic. We always keep that relationship at the center. I'm going to start with just a broad view of what we experienced globally during COVID-19 before popping on about 4 lessons that I'll hopefully get to expand upon a little later. And so just one example, and I have thousands, is how our caregivers went above and beyond. And I saw a question in the chat around older workers. Just so you know, over 1/3 of our Home Instead caregivers are 65 or older. So we really see the value in an older and multi-generational workforce. But near the beginning of the pandemic, one of our caregivers in Switzerland was unable to get to a client in her typical way. It was driving or public transport due to the borders being closed. So she got on her bike and she rode more than 20 miles in winter conditions in order to provide care. And this isn't an anomaly or one special example. It's a shining example of the norm when it comes to our Home Instead professional caregivers. And since the beginning of COVID, our caregivers have served as frontline first responders. We had a location in Wuhan, China. So we mean it when we say since day one of the pandemic, our caregivers and the services that they provided were essential. And for the past 26 years, we've provided this high quality relationship-based care that keeps older adults and their loved ones safe. And during the pandemic, nothing about that changed. We continued to provide on-demand training to our network. And since COVID, we've standardized various trainings related to hygiene, to PPE, caring for individuals with infectious diseases. In a matter of weeks, we stood up a PPE shop for our global network as an additional way to keep caregivers and clients safe and healthy. So if something changed with respect to how Home Instead provided care during COVID, it was wearing full PPE, or our caregivers would be wearing full PPE. We've always worked to educate and empower our network, as well as those we serve, and this was no different at all. In Shenzhen, China, due to the strict lockdown protocols, we were unable to provide care in a traditional way. So for months, our team provided complimentary virtual check-ins to those we served, not only for a line of sight into the client's mental and physical health, but also in a hope that we could make life less isolating and less lonely for those who were locked down. During the pandemic, we instituted a complimentary anonymous 24/7 support line for our entire North America network for every single caregiver, as well as for every single caregiver's family and their loved ones. And this line is filling a huge need. It has had significant engagement, and we're going to continue to support the mental and emotional health of our network for the long term. And then a final example that I'm going to share in the chat for you, just of one thing we did broadly with respect to COVID, is we provided education for family caregivers. We had an 8-week live chat series and a COVID resource page with respect to how family caregivers really needed support and extra help, and how can Home Instead and experts that we know help empower them during COVID. So with that broad context, I came up with 4 specific lessons that we learned, or maybe we had accelerated during the pandemic, and thinking about how do we plan to take those learnings into the future. First, home is an extension of the healthcare ecosystem, and healthcare can be delivered safely at home. Secondly, there has never been more of an opportune time or an opportune moment for caregiving to become an admired profession globally, as well as a destination career, not a gig job of the future. Third, social isolation and loneliness in older adults, it must be acknowledged and it must be eradicated. It is killing older adults. And finally, and this goes to what Sam shared about the unicorns, my ears always perk up with unicorns. I'm not sure if it's the thing that I'm like, oh, the companies, not the mythical animals. Innovation is never going to be as slow as it is in this moment, and it's never going to be as fast as it is in the next moment. Innovation is only going to continue to rapidly accelerate. So I hope I'll get a chance to touch on those later in the conversation. And Sean, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Emily. That's great. And I think, Emily, there's a few questions coming up. Perhaps you can prepare yourself for later around people working at home more now, and is there an opportunity for older workers to work at home? And maybe you can perhaps talk on some of the technology that you've been working with, how do we actually get elder people to actually be able to use technology better when they're at home, which is difficult, as we know, for people so far. So perhaps I can leave that for you to come back on too. Brilliant. Okay, that's excellent. So Jane, can we move over to you now, please?
Great, thanks, Sean. And hi, I'm going to say hi rather than working out what time of day it is. Great to be with everybody. I'm Jane Ashcroft. So I'm from Anchor Hanover. We're a provider of housing and care. We support about 60,000 older people across England. Workforce of about 10,000 amazing colleagues helping people. So the vast majority of our services are specialist retirement housing, so purpose-built housing for people to be able to age and maintain their independence. And we also have a care home operation. We support about 6,000 residents in care homes, and predominantly people living with dementia. So if we think about the COVID experience from a service provision point of view for our organisation, the things that COVID has accelerated, as everybody has said, and I'm sure we'll all reflect on, the use of technology has really accelerated for us. In particular, helping our care home residents to maintain contact with relatives and loved ones during the period when homes had to be very closed environments. Technology really did play a very important part. So we had a fair amount of comms type tech around the place, but we provided lots of portals in all of our services. And my amazing frontline colleagues, as well as being experts in mental capacity, medication, meaningful activity, can now move between Zoom, WhatsApp, Teams, Blue Jeans, more platforms than I care to mention, to do whatever it takes to help our residents to maintain a level of communication and interaction with families, which has been so important. We've also, in our housing services, as I said, most of what we offer is retirement housing. We've seen technology enabling people who, of course, the majority of all of our residents were shielding during the first UK lockdown. Virtual coffee mornings have become a thing. People who hadn't used technology before, and we've been able to bring people together from across the country, which has been really powerful. We've had specific coffee mornings on specific subjects, or we've just had general opportunities for people to have a chat. I've dropped into some of those, and there's been a lack of cake, which is disappointing, but other than that, the quality of the conversation's been fabulous. So that's been really enlightening for me, the way that we've enabled people who are used to living in a particular community to reach out and meet peers across the country. We have a very active residents council and a range of resident interaction groups. Again, people who traditionally haven't been involved in those activities because they've involved physical meetings and travel have been able to interact with us. So that's been, I hope, a benefit for our residents and also for us as a service provider. It's given us direct access to many more people and their feedback. And I would also say that technology has helped us to drive our business forward. We've been able to look at our processes and our ways of working and take out some inefficiencies, be able to move forward in a way that delivers better value for money for the people using our services and delivers a more efficient platform for us. So technology on many fronts has really accelerated. COVID's also accelerated our thinking about future requirements for the buildings that we operate. So we operate from 1,700 locations, as I said, providing about 60,000 units of accommodation, and really thinking about the future built environment, thinking about some of the things we already knew. Outdoor space is so important to people, the ability for people to get in and out of buildings, but some of the impacts of infection control, we've really, I think, learned a lot, and we've accelerated and put into our future development plans some new requirements or enhanced requirements for the new services that we're building. I think as a society, we've learned about the importance of home for people. So many of us have just had to spend a lot more time in our homes. And we know from everything we read and hear that actually where one lives is so important to every aspect of health and well-being. So as a social housing provider, I think it's really accelerated the understanding for us of living somewhere that's safe, that feels like one's home, where you can be comfortable if you need to be there 24 hours a day. I think that's very helpful as we think about the importance of housing, retirement housing, as part of the overall picture of housing supply in the future. COVID certainly accelerated, I think, the need for reform of the UK social care sector. This isn't a session specifically about that, but certainly the recognition that there has to be reform of how we provide social care has come to the fore. I'm very happy to pick some of those things up in the questions. And also an awareness, I think, of the ageing sector. So much of the COVID period, we have talked about the consequence of age, the impact of COVID for people of particular age groups, and the importance of intergenerational approaches. So I think COVID has accelerated a number of themes that we were certainly working with as a business and that were central to society. COVID's imposed a huge amount of restrictions for us, for our residents and for our workforce. The things that I would particularly focus on, Sam talked about occupancy rates in care services. Certainly for us, the ability for people to move into our services was severely restricted. So we know there are many people who are keen to find a new service, but it's been very difficult for people to move in. Even if it was possible to move in, the reality of moving into a care home and then self-isolating for 14 days is a really, really difficult thing for families and individuals to conjure with. And on a really practical level, we sell apartments, we have retirement housing services where people can buy a property. Just the practical process of moving in has been incredibly complex for people. So COVID has restricted our occupancy, it's restricted admissions. We are, I'm pleased to say, seeing a really positive bounce back. We saw a good uptick in the summer last year and we're seeing positive moves. But undoubtedly, some of those delays and issues will impact on the sector and the viability of some providers in the sector. We've seen a restriction in communal activities in our housing services. I've talked about how technology's helped us, and that's been great. But actually, the whole point of, for many people, the attraction of living in a retirement community is the community and being able to do things together. So people are very, very keen, I know, to get back together, and we're helping people to rebuild that sense of community, both within a retirement environment and also with the local community. We do a huge amount of work with local schools, with youth groups, with Duke of Edinburgh schemes, with students from universities, and all of those abilities to work in an intergenerational way have, of course, been restricted, and we must get back to those quickly. And one of the things that I think is less easy to describe, but quite fundamental, is the homeliness of social care environments has been affected. We've always prided ourselves and really focused on making sure that a care home environment isn't an institution, it is homely, it is somebody's own home, and homeliness is a really important aspect. Now, the nature of a pandemic is that the focus on clinical and infection control is absolutely key. So I find I'm not out and about in our services much at the moment. When I'm out, I still find it quite disconcerting that staff have to be masked all of the time. And I absolutely appreciate why they have to be, but it's a really different feeling compared to the very homely services that we've always sought to operate. I think that's quite an interesting challenge for social care settings going forward, is how we maintain that infection control focus, which isn't going to go away quite rightly, but create that environment of homeliness. And what have we carried on doing despite COVID? An amazing amount of things, really. So I was in one of our care homes yesterday, and my colleagues there were talking about how residents have found joy and fun over the last 12 or 18 months. I think the frontline social care workforce is full of heroes, and not all heroes wear capes, as we regularly say. And actually, people have been supported to continue to have a quality of life in many cases, not always, and clearly very difficult when people are missing their relatives. We were very proud of the fact that when pubs were locked down, actually most of our care homes have got pubs, and our pubs were open when everybody else's were closed. And I use that as a little example of how actually people living in some settings we have been able to support people to continue to have positives in their lives. We've carried on building stuff. So we have built more stuff during the period of COVID, which I'm really delighted about because the demands are so significant. We have 20,000 people on the waiting list for our affordable retirement housing product, 20,000 people. So we know we've got to build more stuff. So the fact we've continued to be on site, we're on site on about 8 locations, we've been buying land and continuing our plans to develop, and we will only accelerate in that department. And we've also carried on recruiting. In fact, during the pandemic, we've been able to perhaps appeal to groups who traditionally haven't thought about our sector as a place to work. The challenge now, of course, is going to be retaining them in the housing and social care sector as other markets where they've worked previously open up. But we have managed to maintain our recruitment activities, to maintain our investment in developing our colleagues. And I think we've learned some new skills in those areas along the way. So I'll look forward to people's questions, and I'll hand back to Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. That's really good. That's really interesting. And interesting, the point about homeliness and the fact that you guys have been working away at breakneck speed despite the pandemic around you to actually make sure that the future state of residential homes are going to be in a different place. And I think it comes up to a conversation around technology again and how people can use technology, how elder people can actually get access to technology and use it to take advantage of these changes. We'll come on to that in a few minutes, but I will go over to Les now. Les, perhaps we can pass over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to our partners today. Fantastic to hear you and your insights. It's the first time I've met all of you, I think, apart from Jane, who I know very well. And yeah, thank you for all of that. I thought what I'd do is attempt very crudely to put a timescale on the pandemic. I mean, I'm very nervous about this, but try to give a top-down view, and then I'll hold my fire on some of the detailed points that we've already heard from the speakers until the chat side of this. So going back to the beginning of all this, there have been about 3.5 million confirmed deaths and 164 million confirmed cases globally. And since December 2020, we've had the equivalent of about 750 million people vaccinated across the world. That assumes 2 vaccinations. So if the vaccination rate continues at this pace, obviously we hope it will get faster, but it could be 3 to 4 years before the whole world's vaccinated, 8 billion people in all. And that depends, of course, on whether we decide to vaccinate younger people as well, which is a really big pending decision, I think. So it's a question of asking what might happen. Will we get the job done or not? And will there be an ongoing problem into the future from new variants and so on, which could evolve from countries that have still not felt the brunt of the pandemic? And of course, what we've seen is a pattern of spread that seems to follow with one epicenter followed by another: China, Italy, Spain, France, UK, Russia, then the USA, South Africa, followed by Brazil, and now India, all of which were caught off guard and seemed powerless in the first few months to do anything. So obviously the jab has been a game changer, but the problem is now this, I think, is will there be other huge outbreaks? What's happening in other populous countries like Nigeria and Africa? That's important because, as you know, we have very strong links with Nigeria, as we have with India as well. And we do have this G7 meeting coming up, and I really think they need to look at this. And I'm echoing opinions by people like Gordon Brown and the World Health Organization here. and there needs to be some international cooperation before we can resume normality in terms of trade and travel. That is, as the World Health Organization argues, there is full control over the pandemic, and clearly we're not seeing that yet. So assuming this is going to be a 3 to 4 year timescale before we're out of this, this will have ramifications for everything we're talking about today, how it's impacting on our different services and so on. And things like vaccine manufacture are going to be, or are, terribly important. Supply side is proving very problematic, and the effectiveness of the vaccine against new strains is always going to be a problem. So the willingness of countries to share their vaccines and share their experience is going to be terribly important. So even if a country or countries are virus-free and on the green list, i.e. we can travel to them, it could still transmit through foreign travel or rogue variants. So it does seem that the UK, other countries too, will need robust systems for the foreseeable future to control outbreaks and stop the spread from other countries. So to me, it's ironic that the deaths from infectious disease have been on the wane for years and years, and we'd almost kind of defeated them and put them to one side, but now they're back again with a vengeance. Now, some specific points about the UK, which all these considerations sit. Admittedly, it's hard to navigate in the fog, which is where we were for much of 2020, but now the fog is lifting, things are getting clearer, but the position is still very fragile. One of the best ways to understand the impact is based on the number of excess deaths. Normally, the UK experiences about 600,000 deaths a year. And what we found, and what ONS has found very helpfully, is that the number of deaths is now around 700,000, an increase of 14%, and the largest rise in 75 years. So that's the context. Will that spurt in deaths continue? Well, the UK already has larger numbers of excess deaths, mainly winter-related for flu-related, cold-related, and interestingly, there's still a relatively low take-up of flu jabs. But putting that aside, we know that many of the deaths have been in vulnerable groups, and that suggests to me that their deaths have in fact been brought forward in time, some by a few months and some by many years. And so what else has resulted from this? Well, estimates vary, but if people continue to die at the same rate as now, or men continue to die at the same rate as now, then life expectancy at birth could drop by about 1.3 years and slightly less for women, about 1 year. I've seen similar figures for the US, but it's important to stress that it will be higher in some groups more than others, reflecting things like ethnicity and living arrangements. Indeed, in the US, I've seen estimates of 2 to 3 years quoted amongst some of the minority groups there. But having said that, it also means that life expectancy could bounce back. The argument being that the more lots of people have died disproportionately that might have died anyway within the ensuing months and years. We won't actually know until all the data are in, but some recent figures I saw show that excess mortality is now below the long-term average for this time of the year. So a couple of further points before I stop. What does this mean? Well, I think one of the biggest things will be the healthcare legacy. It's something that Sam referred to earlier. First, queues for treatment and appointments have gone through the roof and could take years and years to clear. One of my students did some very interesting work on this and confirms Sam's point about the balance between elective and non-elective treatments and how they have ballooned. We know that the threats will cause higher mortality toll, but this what should we call it, the backlog in treatments will almost inevitably lead to more political demands for greater spending. And health spending is inflating anyway because of the aging population. So we've got a kind of double whammy here going on, which will be very, very difficult to manage. I think a further legacy that we haven't really discussed is the number of people suffering from long COVID, about which we still know very relatively little. Other people here may have some idea of the numbers and what to expect, but we need to find answers to those questions as well. What else can I say? Well, I think I'll stop there if you don't mind.
Yeah.
As I said, I'll keep some of my other comments on the specifics.
No, thanks, Les. That's really, really helpful. It's always good to have facts when there's so many debating points around at the moment, around the whole of where we go to base ourselves on facts is very, very important. So perhaps I could open up to questions. I've been looking at some of the questions coming through the chat. We had quite a few at the beginning coming through there. But perhaps maybe I'll start with Sam, if I could do. Sam, you were talking about the 50,000 missed cancer diagnosis and the 4 million who less elective procedures. You also said a lot of the problem we have is the lack of innovation. Yeah, you mentioned the fact lack of innovation out there, and I was just seeing your comment. David Sinclair put a question in there a few minutes ago too. One thing he was talking about was about the program that the LC are actually looking at the moment, which is around the fact is looking for ideas around this, the Work for Tomorrow program around. Can we see, let's understand what innovations and policy ideas are there that exist that we should focus on. So if we could perhaps Sam and maybe some of the other panelists too to comment on what sort of innovation should we be looking for? What sort of innovation should, I mean, one of the things we do pride ourselves as a country is our innovation capability. So I think this is a very important area for to consider. So we need to get thoughts from around the panel on innovations for this.
So would you like me to start, Sean?
Why don't you start, Sam?
Yeah, great. So I spoke too loosely when I said, oh, there's not innovation. I mean, obviously we're a country that is like packed to gills, with heaps of different types of innovation, much of what we talked about. I suppose what I was talking about is in two specific areas. So number one, how do you find people who fundamentally not presented to the health service? That's a pretty difficult area to innovate around. And that's the kind of the cancer diagnosis problem is we know that 50,000 people have not been diagnosed relative to the previous year, but we just don't know where they are. And so some of the work that I've heard talk about this, but I'm no expert, so others feel free to come in, is to wonder if these are folks that have got other signs of disengagement with healthcare. So people who are maybe not taking up vaccine appointments, maybe people who are not arriving for screening appointments. And is there some of the work that we've done for to combat vaccine hesitancy that we can do for those type of folks? So it's not, whizzy digital, it's more like social engagement and the way we present and provide healthcare. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing on elective care is, I mean, there's always innovation around lots of things, but it hasn't historically been such an area of focus for the country. If you look back at the long-term plan, it's not like there was a huge section on, oh, we're going to do our elective surgery more efficiently. I mean, there are plenty of models, like in India. There are plenty of models of having kind of parallel theatres running, where you have a single surgeon between like 5 theatres and just kind of coming in to do the essential stuff, and having many more kind of technicians involved in the more routine aspects. So there's lots that we can learn from other countries who do kind of have way more elective surgical throughput than us, but that's pretty fundamental changes to clinical pathways. It's not the kind of thing that you're going to do in 2 months. So I'll stop there on those two specifics, because there's lots that others will say about more broadly useful. Innovation.
Who else would like to come in?
Happy to hop in.
Jane, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Emily. I won't be.
Yeah,
I think Sam's point about kind of innovation in social engagement is a really fertile area. I know even before the pandemic, in some parts of the country, there were relationships between organisations like ours and local fire authorities. Often the fire brigades, who are going in to check people's properties for fire safety and to install fire alarms, were really able to spot older people who were isolated, or were able to spot people at perhaps the beginning of an aging stage. And I think that ability to think really cross-agency and not think the prevention agenda is a really important area for us to engage with, and I think COVID will really help us to think about prevention in a different way. But there's a real opportunity, I think, to use that kind of socially engaged approach and to recognise that what appears as an item of data in one area can be very compelling in other areas. So I really think innovation around social engagement. We talk about tech engagement or tech innovation, and that's important, but the social engagement piece. And I think culturally we're all more attuned to that post the pandemic as well.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Emily. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think some of the failures and the shortcomings that were magnified during the pandemic was due to the continued treatment of older adults as one group, innovators who were innovating for this group of older adults as a homogenous group versus individuals as their individuals. We were witness to the rapid innovation during the pandemic, the development of vaccinations, technology that allowed workers, I'm still working from home until next Tuesday, numerous iterations of Zoom and Teams that allowed for this continued connectivity during the pandemic. And we witnessed light speed innovation around telehealth, remote monitoring capabilities, and other innovations that will allow younger generations to one of the questions, and I'm going to touch on a specific one, to really connect with older adults if it's not safe for an in-person connection. Before I talk about 3 specific innovations that we've witnessed that we're aware of, I want to give some context on how Home Instead views technology and innovation as relationship-based care, hands-on care is our primary model. We see our caregivers in the home, they see the smartphone maybe in a drawer, the tablet collecting dust on a shelf, the fall monitor hanging on a bedpost. And without use, these innovations are absolutely useless. Without a compelling why as to why the older adults and their families should plug into these different innovations, there's going to be no data, there's going to be no uptick, and there's going to be no advantage for older adults and the caregivers. That's where Home Instead comes in with our relationship-based care. Our caregivers can be the catalyst as well as the connector when it comes to different innovations. Quite often, there's a fear of disrupting an entire system when it comes to new technology. I even worry when I get a new widget or whatever, am I going to screw this up? So having a relationship-based caregiver who can work with an older adult on the innovation to really connect them with it, that is key going forward. And then Sean, you mentioned GrandPad. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. In the States, there's a company called GrandPad. They have an in-home tablet for elders. And when they created their tablet, and this goes to my first point, in each iteration of such, they had a team of grand advisors, older adults who would be using the tablet. They were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and I believe 1 or 2 were over 100. One thing that the grand advisors, they taught the team at GrandPad through this co-creation was the need for a different type of screen. As the skin changes as we age, it becomes more tissue-like, and the traditional tablet screens didn't work due to this specific condition. Another thing we learned was that there needed to be an easy way to plug it in. When they went into one of the homes of the grand advisors at one of the first iterations of the GrandPad, she had a very, very long extension cord throughout her living room so it could always be plugged in, which, as a lot of us know, that's a huge fall risk. So they came up with a very, very easy way to charge it. I also think about innovation, that it needs to be made for and by the senior, and it needs to be seamless with respect to everyday life. There's a gentleman in the Netherlands, he's a friend of Home Instead. He actually was part of our South by Southwest programming, which the very esteemed David Sinclair also participated in. And Han is an influencer, he's an inventor, he's an octogenarian. He won Aegon's Silver Starters Challenge in 2019 through creating a solution to a very real problem, his adult son. His adult son would regularly call him to check in when he was really checking on Han. And these conversations unintentionally begin to diminish Han. So he and his adult son together, they innovated. Han created this widget of sorts that connected to his water usage. He's also expanded this widget so it connects to the power usage, so his son could actually check on him without the frequent checking in. And it's now used widely within the Netherlands. And then one more innovation from Home Instead that I think will really tee up the work around multi-generational, the questions around multi-generational connections, is through Champions of Aging. Champions of Aging is a service year opportunity built in part with Service Year Alliance. We're hoping it's going to make the world a better and a kinder place to grow old in. Individuals within Champions, they're usually right out of university doing a gap year, but we also have opportunities for people in the workforce who need a break, maybe older adults who've retired, and this just gives them a refresher of what they want to do next, what's next. But it's a service year working intensively at a local nonprofit focused on aging population and age-related issues. It gives these people really a deep understanding of the individualized aging experience so they can be agents of change wherever their life takes them. And I'll put a link in chat where you can find out more, but our world needs more healthcare professionals and elder professionals who understand that healthy active aging and the impacts of age-related diseases. We need people in construction, to Jane's point, when she's talking about the 20,000 people on the wait list who understand how to build for an older population. We need finance professionals who understand how to save for the 100+ year life that we're all going to live, and innovators who can design and implement that next generation of platform and technologies.
Good, thank you, Emily. Fascinating. So lots we can learn from the US as well. Well, actually, on that point, there's been a number of questions around. Well, one question about how do we innovate in readiness for the next pandemic and learnings, how do we take the learnings? And you mentioned, Les, you talked about the G7 meeting coming up, conversations that we're having, and obviously the role of where ILC is actually playing. Obviously our partners expect, our partners expect ILC to be playing in trying to lobby to make sure that we do learn from a government point of view, but also learnings from across the world. So I'd be interested to get some thoughts, maybe from you, Les, first, as you mentioned G7 coming up. Do you think there's an opportunity here to make sure that everyone perhaps owns up to some of the issues that have occurred over and really be open, be transparent to what's happened? So we, as a globe, should we say, we can actually learn from this going forward and share. Be interested to get your views, Les, on that.
Well, I certainly would hope so. At the moment, the implicit policy is for each country that's in the position to do so is to vaccinate its whole population before lifting its horizons and looking to help other countries. There's a very crude synopsis. So those countries which managed to get their orders in quickly are reaping the benefits from that, and those that didn't of course losing out and going to the back of the queue. And it really does need intervention from something like the G7 to really change that dynamic, because otherwise we could be left with a situation of the haves and have-nots, but with the disease continuing to circulate and cross boundaries and all sorts of no-go zones and what have you, which is not a very enticing prospect. But if I could just sort of shift the conversation just a little bit back, and I see some questions on it as well, Sean, which is the change in, well, effectively it's to do with the change in the demand for travel. So the demand for travel between countries is obviously registering in terms of the inability to take holidays and all that sort of thing. But the question is whether it would be a permanent change or not. And what we've seen already in the UK is a big change in shopping and working habits, and whether that's going to sustain or return to normal. I don't think it will return to normal, because many will have tasted the convenience of online shopping, especially convenience goods like food and foods, and many will actually like working from home, and I think many employers are actually encouraging that. So could this reduced demand for travel actually be a good thing? I mean, we can, for example, breathe cleaner air for a start in our cities, which won't be a bad thing. But remember, commuting, especially in big cities like London, could be taking up 2 hours of your time each day, 2 hours which could be used for other more social activities, like being more neighbourly, meeting other people in your street and neighbourhood and actually talking to them. So people that have said that it could lead to an increase in isolationism, loneliness. I'm not completely convinced of that. It could be a different. Now you can apply that model on a local scale, and I would see maybe your radius of interaction, if you like, with your local community, perhaps, or daily travel space shrinking, perhaps more localism in terms of services being provided locally or delivered to you over time. And perhaps that could apply internationally as well, with maybe less foreign travel and so on. Now, that's a very difficult thing to pull off, especially in the UK, because the UK, people in the UK love their foreign holidays so much, and they are all sun seekers because we get no sun, unlike many other countries. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to manage and so on. And there is a pretty good evidence that the second wave last year originated from people returning from Spain and other holiday destinations. And I think that's hanging over us in the next few months as well. So it's, I suppose, what economists used to call the tragedy of the commons, each individual seeking to maximize their own gain from a particular situation, but actually collectively leading to possibly a disaster or a catastrophe that we can't manage. So that would be my take on it.
Good. No, thank you. Very useful thoughts. So I was going to put a question, Jane, there's a question for you from Jenny Bristow around the importance of intergenerational contact, really talking about the fears that younger people might have to infect older people. What do you think might be done to counter the sense of estrangement moving forwards?
Yeah, it's a really important area, I think. Even before the pandemic, I think in some areas of public policy, there was sometimes a rather false construct in the debate about having to make difficult choices about our country's resources. So, you know, the classic debate about social care funding is often, well, can we afford to put more money into older people's services? We need to support young people. One of the debates in the housing supply issue is we need to get young people on the housing ladder. And we would always contend that the other end of the housing ladder is just as important. If we have good quality retirement housing for people at the top of the ladder, that helps to free up the bottom of the housing ladder for other age groups. But to particularly pick up on Jenny's question about the consequence of the pandemic for intergenerational issues, I think our experience is that individuals tend to think in terms of their family group or the people about whom they care. So we did have the messaging at some point in the UK during the pandemic about, you know, make sure you don't kill granny. It was a very clunky message, I think, from a couple of people, but the principle behind it of young people might not be as dramatically affected by infection, but they can have an impact on others, was well intentioned. And certainly we have, you know, seen some concern between age groups about impacts of infection. But I do think actually the cross-generational views, there is sort of fertile ground for people to get back out there and mix. I think technology has helped because you can have safe, regular contact with people using technology. I think I said before, you know, we have traditionally have very strong relationships between our services and local schools. We work to facilitate intergenerational activity. We've got a very strong apprenticeship programme in Anchor Hanover, and our apprentices, who are generally school leavers, not always, but many of our apprentices are school leavers, bring a whole different dimension to our care settings. So I think we need a kind of multi-channel approach to intergenerational issues, and we need to make sure that there isn't an oversimplistic view of the consequence of the pandemic for different age groups. I'd link it as well to the earlier query about future pandemic preparedness. I am no clinician or statistician, but the things that I sort of pick up in my reading is every pandemic is different. It would appear that the planning that had been done in the UK was certainly for a flu-based pandemic, and we found ourselves not with a flu-based pandemic. So I think we also have to be careful that the assumptions or the learning from one terrible and challenging experience isn't then extrapolated to the assumption that the next time we have to deal with a pandemic, it will be a pandemic that disproportionately affects older people. My understanding is that previous pandemics have not had an impact on older people necessarily, I think, but I'm no expert on this. The Spanish flu, as it was called, had a particular impact on younger age groups. So I think it's incumbent on all of us who work in the sector and all of us as responsible citizens to be careful that we don't get into stereotypical thinking or to be too narrow in our thinking. And we've just got, I mean, I noticed there's comment in the Q&A about ageism. I think we just have to keep battling within our approach to inclusion and diversity, recognizing that ageism in any direction is ineffectual. It's bad for everybody, and it's something that we must challenge at every turn.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very good. Sam, I've noticed you've been very prolific in your answers and the questions. So well done. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that. But I was going to ask one specific question there that was picked up then around it. I think it was the last question that came through. Maybe you could pick up on it. It's about encouraging elder people out of isolation. Again, this is sort of like goes back to this point you said about before about the intergenerational to a degree too, to make sure how do we get them out. Be interested to get your thoughts on what do we do to get people active, get them out, get them involved, whether we use more technology or sort of social gathering. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts, because again, this factor about ageism has come up a few times too, and it's important to make sure that the older people are seen to be really in part of the community, and isolation has become a big issue, of course, during the pandemic, especially those who are not in homes so much. Obviously, they're isolated from their families, but there have been a lot of people alone in their houses, as we know, and parents we can talk about ourselves. Interesting, Sam, to get your reflection on that, if possible.
Oh yeah,
it's a big topic, Sam.
Exactly. Like, save the toughest question for me. Sorry. Other than the one on active travel. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is really tough, because if you'd said pre-pandemic, what are some of the ways of addressing this? I think the communities that I'd seen that had been most successful were where there was kind of close integration, a bit like Jane was talking about earlier, between the voluntary sector, the local authority, and the health service. And that can take lots of different guises. It can take the guises of personalized care plans. It can take the guises of, so personalized care plans, not just, this is what you must do for your health needs. It's, this is how you can interact with people. This is what you can do for exercise. In some areas, it had been a kind of health system-based prescribing of exercise. So, for example, I worked in the lovely borough of Newham, East London, where things like a swim were prescribed or a walk were prescribed, much like you would prescribe a medicine. Now, I'm a little bit too far away from the health system now to know. I would imagine a lot of that has kind of ground to a halt. So I think more the question is, as we emerge from kind of mandated isolation, to what extent can that either recommence, or can there be some, in cases where it can't recommence, are there some substitutes that can maybe at least encourage activity at home, even if it's not kind of social connection? And so I answered about some of the innovations we're seeing in one of the previous answers.
No, thank you. I mean, Jane, you probably see that a lot within your retirement homes too. I mean, it'd be interesting, people coming into retirement homes. How do you see we tackle this?
I think, the fact that we can now open up our services and encourage people in, the fact that often we need to look at the built environment of our retirement services as community assets as well. Yeah. So, pre-pandemic, certainly in the UK, we'd seen quite a reduction in many community-based services that had been supported by local authorities, for instance. And so one of the things I think that it's incumbent on the ageing sector to do is to think about our assets as community assets. And to make sure, for instance, that we have a retirement village not far out of London that has a fabulous village hall that's used by the local community. So it is important, I think, that we have a mindset and an approach that isn't about that we can help people to assess their own risk and to make sure they feel safe without creating closed environments and closed communities. And I know there's a really good question on the Q&A about how we get the balance between keeping people safe and empowering and maintaining people's independence. I think that tension has always been an issue in care settings in particular, because actually most of the things that give people joy in life involve a degree of taking risk, whether it's eating too many cream cakes, drinking the odd gin and tonic, getting outside for a walk. And I think we do need to make sure we continue to kind of reevaluate that issue about people choosing to take personal risk and us not feeling, to use a somewhat contentious expression, that we have to kind of put a ring of steel around people because they're in need of social care. So I think it's really important. And a lot of this does come back to the link with ageism, that we don't make assumptions about, because somebody is a particular age, that means that certain things will be required in order to keep them safe. All of us will have individual journeys in our aging years. We'll deal with particular issues, we'll have different lifestyle aspirations and expectations, and we need to reflect all of those. So I think in the chat, Emily's made the point about treating people as individuals, and that's a really important principle, I think, and we mustn't let the experience of the pandemic create a whole new layer of expectations that we can stratify people by their age and therefore make assumptions about them.
Good, thank you. Thanks, Jane. We are running short of time, but there's one question I was going to put to all of you who's come up here. I'll save that question for 5 seconds to get you on your feet. But a question coming up, which I'll perhaps have a final sort of say around this. It's basically the question, which is, when will we recognise the need for long-term care revolution post-COVID? Yeah, and I want to get you, each of you give a reflection on that. Just be into your personal views and thoughts. And that, again, this is something for us as an ILC. We're looking at how we can actually help and support as an institution with you as partners to actually see how we can help and focus, whether it's in lobbying, as I say, or whatever before. But we need to get individually your thoughts. Perhaps we can start, Emily, with you, and we can go around and just get
Oh
your
my goodness, I answered that chat thoroughly. So do you want me to read it?
Well,
I'm kidding. I will not read it.
Just give your key points. Yeah, I think you've just written them. This is what you have.
No, absolutely. First of all, Shirley, I loved the way that you worded it, a long-term care revolution. And one of the things we learned coming out of the pandemic that I shared with you, one of those lessons is home is the safest place to age. It's also the most desired and also the most scalable. It's also going to be, for governments who pay for older adults, the most cost-effective option. We saw all the COVID really magnified all the different challenges that come with traditional healthcare, that traditional healthcare ecosystem. And it gave us a glimpse into what we're going to see with the 500+ million baby boomers entering the highest and most expensive healthcare years of their lives. So one thing that gave me hope coming out of this was the Japanese government. As you know, Japan is the oldest society in the world. It's a super aging society, very traditional, and they recognize telehealth as a solution coming out of the COVID pandemic. That's really important. That's huge. So coming up, all different stakeholders that touch humanity, having policymakers, having NGOs, organizations like the ILC with conversations like this, having private sector companies come together and innovate for this revolution on how we can keep older adults safe at home, with home being the primary site of care for the future. I think that will really help that revolution that you speak of. Again, Shirley, a tremendous question. And thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Les, a quick word from you, then perhaps Sam, and then Jane. Yeah.
Well, I do think the financing long-term care is the key thing here, and the disproportionate costs that are met by some people and not by others, and that the blockages in the system seem to be it's almost like it's a Mexican standoff between the insurance companies and the government on the question of who pays and how much do they pay. And in this area, I've long advocated policies. So for example, paying for long-term care upfront can be hugely expensive. Even paying for the premiums on an insurance policy can seriously eat into your post-retirement income. So one of the things I've advocated, and in fact talked to Jane a lot about, is the idea of a consume now, pay later sort of policy, in which you, for example, use the equity in your home to buy a insurance policy which at least gets you access to long-term care should you need it, but the premium on that policy is not paid until you have actually died. And since most people need long-term care, I don't know what Jane would say, but maybe a year, sometimes less, a bit more. Occasionally there are some that go on for years and years, but the average suggests, and the economic financial modelling we've done suggests that's a very reasonable approach to take. But there are others as well. Again, using all your wealth, not just your income, so that you can plan ahead. Now, that has numerous other advantages too, because it means that you will have time, for example, to plan your inheritance. You can gift your assets if you want much earlier, before in the certainty that your long-term care costs would be covered by this kind of approach. And that can be very helpful to your children who might be trying to get on the housing ladder, who might need money to pay for education and so on. And somehow all that seems to have been missed in the thinking of how to pay for social care or long-term care, because it can be applied to earlier phases.
We're just losing you, David. We're just losing your internet reception.
So that's where I see the big issue being. I think the supply side will take care of itself.
Thank you, Les. Thank you. Brilliant. Sam, any reflections yourself?
Yeah, maybe to echo a couple and add a few. I mean, this is a debate we were actually having the other day at a kind of internal L&G session on inclusive capitalism, where we're trying to understand the balance between the innovation that we're seeing in home care that Emily was talking about regarding remote monitoring, telehealth, etc. It certainly feels like it's got the potential to keep people at home for longer, but let's see what the data shows. And then we're also seeing lots of, some innovation in care home design and delivery, so more kind of, family style, smaller pods, or different kind of star-shaped designs or unit-shaped designs that we've seen in other countries. So certainly the green village kind of concept. So we're certainly seeing some small little steps in different ways that care can be provided. But I agree with Emily, it's a little way away from the revolution that Shirley is asking for. And so I suppose the thing we're wondering is exactly what Les is wondering. Is the change in financing going to be the thing that actually does revolutionize this market? Or is it going to be a little bit like we've seen in healthcare, that it's not financing, but actually some kind of technical or design innovation that changes it? Anyway, Jane, I'll leave it to you because you're the most expert of the lot of us on this.
Goodness me. I was once told that an expert is defined as an X is a has-been and a spurt is a drip under pressure.
Exactly. It's no longer a compliment in this country. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm just trying to downplay. So I think, when will the revolution come? For those of us who've been working in and around aged care in the UK, the revolution's been coming for so long. It's really difficult to understand why it hasn't happened. The case seems so compelling for fundamental change, and yet. So I think it has to be a political issue, and I'm not making a party political point by any means, but I think this is about when does this become such a compelling and intersected issue. I think we really struggle with the fact that there's such a complex mix of areas of public policy and economy that link together in this debate about ageing. This is about care, it's about employment, it's about the tax system, it's about the benefit system, it's about the housing market, it's about it. So, and I think that's why it's very hard sometimes for things to change, because we pull at one little thread and think, so in order to sort this out, we also have to deal. I think, though, that is the thing that makes the revolution in ageing and care happen, is the threads are all on the move. And I would draw a parallel with climate change. I think for many years there has been an awareness and a debate and a discussion about climate change, but something has to kind of accelerate. And for me, it's the fact that there are very few families or social groups in this country who are not affected by demographic change. It is just becoming an issue of a tipping point. And I think we all know we're living with models that were built in that post-war era. You know, the 1948 National Assistance Act is the basis of how social care works in the UK. I think we know that we're probably heading for another post-war sort of period. The pandemic seems to have accelerated that sense that this is another time for, and so I am the eternal optimist. I think the revolution is coming. It's coming because consumers are, demographic changes affecting the consumer base, demographic changes affecting the shape of families, demographic changes affecting our working lives, it's affecting our benefit system, our pension system. So I think that it's which bit goes first in order to make that change. And but it does feel, I'm feeling quite revolutionary at the moment. I don't think it can be too far away.
Well, I'm with you, Jane. I'm with you on that one. So that's a great way to wind up the chat there, because basically the revolution is coming, and you're right. So we have a global pandemic. We know that the whole of climate change is on the agenda at the G7 as a top priority. What else do you need? What else do you need, given the evidence that we've got around the world? And let's hope we can share that. And that's, as Les's point about the G7, maybe this is something that we can help try and push from an ILC perspective to make sure this is really on the agenda, if we can't change the agenda by now. So look, I thought it was a great debate. So thank you very much. We've tried to answer most of the questions, and we will come back to those questions that are unanswered. We'll come back to you on those too. And we'll make sure, I think if it's been in the chat, we'll share the data, the information with you. But really a big thank you to my speakers, and me throwing questions at you left field there now and again, and who joined all this today. A very big thank you to all our partners. I mean, look, you as partners who attend this, it's you what make the ILC, it's you who help us fund us, it's your thoughts and ideas we take forward. So a big thank you on behalf of the ILC for all of you who take part in this. And I just wanted to perhaps give a couple of little adverts for a few ILC things that are coming along at the moment. I mean, you're all members of our partners program, and obviously we've got a big conference coming, the Future of Aging conference on the 2nd of December. The tickets, the 7th one we've got. This year's theme is all on diversity and how we can make aging work for everyone. Again, it will be post the G7, and hopefully there'll be more debate coming out of that, and I'm sure hopefully all our political parties will be playing some sort of role in supporting this. And we hope some other events we've got coming up too. We've got a Global Alliance webinar, Why Gender Matters, exploring the impact of gender in health and well-being, and it's taking place on the 2nd of June. There's a report launch on the Invisibles epidemic, rethinking the detection and treatment of structural heart disease in Europe on the 3rd of June. And a report launch on the longevity of supporting legends on Thursday, the 10th of June. I hope you guys can attend that. I hope you can find some time in your diaries to do that. There's lots of news on the ILC's latest webinars. You can stay up to date with the ILC news on our website, ilcuk.org.uk. I'm sure you can find that, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And this has all been recorded on YouTube. I should have said this at the beginning. So this is all live. If you really want to go and see it again, or show it to your friends. But look, thank you again, wonderful speakers for taking part in this, putting your time, and for all our partners too for joining this session. Please look forward to you joining us on future sessions, and thank you again from myself.